morning. This is Saturday, August the 18th, 2007, and we are in New York City, and we are speaking with Dr. Michael Wilkins. And Dr. Wilkins, I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I'm a medical doctor. I'm from Kansas City, Missouri, and in 1967 I came to New York to do my internship and residency and complete my military obligation in the United States Public Health Service on Staten Island. And as a result of being on Staten Island, got familiar with Willowbrook State School, which at that time was the largest institution for the mentally retarded in the world, and a very large presence on Staten Island where I was living. And after I got out of the United States Public Health Service, I was there for 3 years. Then for a year and a half, I was employed at Willowbrook.
What were the circumstances that brought you to work over there? Were you attracted to the kind of work that you were going to be doing?
I was, and my good friend Bill Bronston was already working there when I was an intern on pediatrics at the hospital where I was an intern. They took us to Willowbrook to show us a variety of genetic abnormalities. Willowbrook was a repository of many genetic abnormalities, and they had a way that we could see them, having an opportunity to visualize these people so that we could recognize them in the future, because they were all collected there at Willowbrook. And that was the way we all got familiar with Willowbrook. And I told Bill about this place, and Bill had an interest. Bill Bronston was a medical doctor, had an interest in developmental disabilities, or mental retardation as it was called in those days, and actually became employed there and was coming home and telling me stories about the conditions there that were unbelievable, unbelievably bad. And so we went to work there largely with a view to try to understand the place and see if it could be made better, if we could play a role in that.
Okay. Tell us more.
The circumstances were extremely adverse. The place was extremely crowded. It had been built for 2,700 individuals, and 5,700 were living there. There would be large rooms, day rooms, where in my building 70 mentally retarded people would be congregated in one large day room with nothing to do, just sitting on church pews, or in some day rooms not even having church pews but plastic chairs. 1 or 2, 3 at the most attendants to take care of these people. Common bathrooms with no privacy, no inmate there, and I call them inmates because I believe it was more like a concentration camp or a prison than a healthcare facility. No inmate had any possessions that they could keep themselves. They had a small little box, a wire box, or sometimes they were in wooden boxes, where their clothes and their possessions were kept. They couldn't possibly have more than that because the crowding was so great. There was just no room to keep their stuff. So they were floating as human beings, floating without any sense of identity. They were in a mass of other people. And they couldn't be kept clean, they couldn't be fed decently, and therefore the medical conditions that we were asked to take care of, because this was a quote medical model, we were the doctors, that was the way this place was justified as being a state school and a place where they could be taken care of by doctors. But still, the conditions there created chaos, and so there was no progressive medical care. There was just custodial care. These people were brought to Willowbrook to die there. They would be brought sometimes as a young child, and most of the time, and they would stay there without services, without going to school, without training, just rocking in a big empty room with surrounded by other mentally retarded people. It was chaotic and disorienting for somebody that would first go there.
Now, you said that you had some warning that there were some intolerable conditions before you actually went over to work, but on a personal level, what's it like to walk into a place like this and to try to adjust yourself to these dysfunctional circumstances?
The first thing that assaults you when you walk in the building is the smell, and that sets the tone for the whole experience. The smell is a smell of decay and a mixture of sweat and feces and lack of being cleansed in large numbers of people, and it permeated the building. And so you open the door and you step back, and then you have to walk into it, and then on the outside of the large day rooms would be the medication room where the nurses would stay. The nurses were at a higher level than the attendants. In the day room, the attendants would be in these large rooms with the inmates. And so for a young doctor, coming out of an internship and a residency where there were clean hospitals that smelled good, it was a starkly different and depressing environment. Ultimately depressing. I mean, you go in your office and you'd say, what am I doing here? What's going on here? What chance do I have of making these people in any way better?
What and how do you come to a conclusion to stay and continue there then?
Hoping that you can make it better and realizing that you can't do that without beginning to try to change the underlying conditions.
Okay. Tell me more about who the clients of this facility were. What types of individuals, where did they come from?
They came mostly from New York City. It's been called the Big Towns Leper Colony, where parents of mentally retarded people had no community services. They couldn't keep their kids at home unless they were independent, had the independent funds to hire people to take care of them. There were no group homes for the retarded. There were no special ed classes. There were no facilities where developmentally disabled people could be serviced in the community so they could stay with their parents. And the parents would get burned out. They would be struggling to, one of them would have to stay home with this child in order to keep the child out of the institution. If they didn't have the money, if they were a single parent, there's just no way they could avoid institutionalizing their child. And there was actually a waiting list, and the community physicians would recommend institutionalization in those days.
And what was the range of developmental disabilities that you saw among the residents?
From severely retarded people, the ones with what we call anencephaly, where the actual, their head is very small and they just have very little brain function and they're not capable of doing anything other than really eating and carrying out their vegetative functions, to kids who could talk to you and had obvious ability to interact with me and wanted out and were aware that they were in a bad place. They could watch TV and see what real life is. And so there was a whole range from severely and profoundly mentally retarded individuals to mildly retarded individuals who were, by the way, kept there as working boys and working girls and made to mop the floors and prepare the meals and do the things that needed to be done to keep this concentration camp going.
And was there any kind of range of care that was provided, or was it pretty much one size fits all, that everybody, regardless of your ability level, got the same treatment?
No, there would be different levels of treatment. Some of the higher functioning individuals would be sent to classes. Probably 10% of the residents at Willowbrook would be in classes, of the school-age children would be in classes. There was a model vocational program where they would teach woodworking, but none of those people ever got discharged from Willowbrook because they got more money if they had more residents, and these higher functioning ones were easier to take care of and actually could be working within the institution. So, but I have to say that for the severely and profoundly mentally retarded people, they were simply kept, rocking and with no services whatsoever, and the few services that they had were more reserved for the more higher functioning individuals.
So it was basically more like a warehousing of these individuals.
It was a warehouse indeed.
Yeah. Can you tell me more about the people who worked at the facility? What were the types of individuals and the jobs that they were performing?
The bulk of the individuals were attendants, who were the frontline workers out there in the day room, working with the inmates. And their job would be to try to bathe them, and the method of bathing would be to get 6 or 8 of them together in the shower room and get the hose and hose them down. And they would be squatting there, and water would be run over them. Keep them clean. For the incontinent ones, they would have to clean up after them. For the ones that were continent, they would have to usher them back into the bathroom. Keep them clothed, because if their clothing got dirty, they would have to try to change their clothes. Try to just police them, because there would be, in my building, 70 individuals milling around, and there were 4 day rooms in my building. And so there was a day room for the severely and profoundly retarded, in which some of these kids would be on the floor, and they would be kept in a straitjacket, because otherwise they would scratch themselves or assault other patients, and they would just be rocking on the floor. And others would simply be sitting motionless. The employees would have to train these and try to train them to not move around and not make a fuss, because it was so much easier to take care of 70 people if they just don't move around very much. And then there was a higher functioning room, and there were 4 levels, and each was at a different functional level. One was for people who were blind, or many of them had autism, and weren't that really retarded, but just were autistic. And so they would have employees who would mostly be disciplinarians and lead them and pick out ones who could work in their own right. So those were the attendants, and they were many good people. I want to emphasize that they certainly weren't bad people. They were in an environment where it was pretty impossible to be functioning in any good way, and I felt that myself. But to get back to your question about what kind of employees were, then there were licensed practical nurses, and they were mostly medication givers. These were heavily medicated people, they didn't need to be medicated, or they wouldn't need to be if they weren't in that building. But in order to contain them and lower their energy level, they would be given strong tranquilizers. Some of them had seizure disorders, and their seizure medication would have to be regulated. Then there would be a building supervisor. Sometimes that would be a person with a nursing degree, but in my building it was a guy who had no nursing background. He was just a management guy. He was the person that would answer to the administration building and carry out their orders. And then there were housekeeping people in charge of cleaning up, but mostly they would utilize the inmates to do that job. And then there were a smattering of recreation therapists. They would take a group of 10 people at a time, and they would walk around the grounds of Willowbrook to get them outdoors. There were some school teachers, because some of these kids would be going to classes. So that was the kind of place it was.
Was there a hierarchy to the staff structure?
Yes, the administration had a large building, a multi-story building. It was shaped like a cross, and that was the first building you saw when you drove onto the grounds. And the grounds were plush. It was very big grounds and treed, and a nice rural, semi-rural atmosphere on Staten Island, with 27 buildings that housed inmates, and probably an equal number of buildings that performed other functions. And so the structure was that the administration was the head of the Hydra. You know, they were the brains of the outfit, and they would give the orders. The structure for the shifts, who would show up, would be designed by the building supervisor and okayed by the administration building. They had some professionals, such as social workers. They had a Department of Social Service, which I think had 7 social workers for the entire institution, with 5,700 clients, and about 3 psychologists, and their job mostly was to do intelligence testing. They would test these people when they were admitted, and to try to grade them to see how much funds they could get from the funding agencies. But the low person on the totem pole was the attendant, and again, the point person, and they would be completely taking their orders from the building supervisor, and to a lesser degree from the licensed practical nurses.
Did you experience typical days? I mean, were your days typical? Were they always different?
There were typical days. It was a pretty regimented place. I had responsibility for Building 6 and most of the time Building 5, and I would go there, and the first part of the day was given over to handling any medical emergencies or situations that had developed overnight or since I'd last been there. And these clients would be brought out to the treatment room, and I would see them. And most of the time it would be cuts, scratches, bruises, trauma from other patients, or I really didn't know from who, but that would be a large part of it. There would be people who were losing weight, people who were having uncontrolled seizures or uncontrolled behavior problems, and that was the bulk of it. So then that would be the morning. And then in the afternoon I would be trying to organize a care plan meeting in which we would focus on one individual and see what services would be good for them and what services they were getting and what the results of those services were. That was a new thing. I mean, most of the time it was a custodial warehousing operation, and no one much thought about that because there was so little chance that the clients would ever be discharged from the institution. But in order to just meet medical standards, one had to justify what was going on and in some way document what should go on and what the potential was.
So, I mean, you're looking at that as basically just a pro forma exercise that you were going through?
It was something that there was really, you could do that paperwork without actually convening a meeting of the attendants and the caregivers, but I was trying to convene such a meeting so that we could think in terms of developmental model rather than a custodial model.
Trying to deal with the individual and provide some kind of plan that's going to help that individual.
Right. Try to create the sense that the institution should be there to respond to the needs of the individual, and instead of the individual just conforming to what the limitations of the institution were.
Sure. You know, tell me more about, you know, as you're trying to do this, and you mentioned that when you went to work there, you had some hope that perhaps you could make a difference in bringing about some better care. You mentioned earlier that there were a lot of good people who were there. What was the attitude among the staff, or tell me even more about the range of attitudes among the staff about what they were doing?
the staff was a varied group of people, and in general, it was a very repressive atmosphere. One of the most important psychological needs would be to justify what was happening to these people. And so everybody would justify it in their own way. And I want to emphasize that the essential justification was in the way the inmates were defined. And it was that a mentally retarded person doesn't really feel pain, and it is not possible to improve them, that they will not learn, and that they are a stain on their family, that they should be taken out of their family for the sake of the family. All of these justifications were put on, and all these stigmas were put on the clients by the medical profession, my fellow doctors, and by the whole political setup in the state, which was to not provide services for the development of these people, but rather to just take them and put them in an institution, so that the employee is faced with a dilemma. How do I justify this jail that these people are in? So you had to figure that out in your own mind, and some people would respond by becoming a disciplinarian and by being proud that they could establish discipline in their day room, and that all of their charges were sitting there on the bench, and they were rocking, and they weren't talking, and they were not disturbing anything. Some would respond by having favorites. There would be some very compelling and wonderful, responsive clients, inmates, and they would treat them as their own child, and they would give them candy and bring them clothes and try to be nice to them, not necessarily to the other 67 individuals they were in charge of, but they would isolate them as having human qualities and the others as not. Some would seek solace really in drugs and alcohol, and really would be just displacing themselves from that environment, just be there for 8 hours, then I'm out of here, or, don't talk to me, I can't deal with this. And some would be genuinely good and good saints, and try to help all of them and work hard. And so I think each person was left without guidance, and it was partially up to me to try to help give guidance and try to fight that sense, that ideology that said that these inmates were more like animals than humans. I mean, once you establish that definition, that this is a human being, the whole game would have to change, but that wasn't the way mentally retarded people were seen at that time.
Even among the medical staff?
Can we hold this
Correct.
a second?
Sure. Great. Tell me a little bit about the parents. I mean, you mentioned earlier that for a lot of them they were overwhelmed, and there was even a waiting list to try to get their children into this facility. Were they aware of the conditions, and why would they put their children into these circumstances?
They weren't aware of the conditions. They weren't allowed to go into the day room or the sleeping room. And in the sleeping room, there would be 70 beds, cots, lined up with about this much space between each cot. They weren't allowed to go back there. When they would visit, and traditionally the visiting day was on Sunday, people would take the Staten Island ferry, and they would then take the bus to Willowbrook, and they had to provide extra buses on Sunday because they knew that people would be going in large numbers out to Willowbrook. And then they would come to the front door, and they would announce their presence, and their child or their family member would be brought to them, would be dressed and cleaned, and usually the staff would know that this family member would be coming. It'd be kind of predictable. And then they would take them out. Sometimes they would just go walking on the ground. Sometimes they would take them outside of the grounds, and then they would be gone for an hour or two and they would bring them back. That was how they came to the institution, and they were veterans of the system. This was the end of a long odyssey of having born into their family a child with a developmental disability, and seeing the lack of services available for this child and beginning to feel guilty that you even had a developmentally disabled child, that it was a bad report card from God and that it was somehow your fault, and the system wasn't providing you any services, so that was more input that somehow you had to deal with all of this. Having talked to doctors who at that time would recommend institutionalization, would imply or just state that the presence of a retarded child in the family would be harmful to the other siblings. So all of that baggage came with these parents. So most of the time they were just downtrodden and would come to visit. Their love was still there, although many of the clients at Willowbrook didn't get visited, but many did. And they would fiercely love their family members. And we began to see that these family members contained the solution to the problem, that they were the ones that understood the problem, and they were the ones that had the connection, and that they had just been not understanding the potential of their child, and that once that it was understood that this is an individual that can grow and can learn and can function better and can be happy, can exist in society, they would feel differently. And we all became angry as we gradually learned more. It was sort of a mutual learning process. It wasn't as though I knew all of those things when I first went to Willowbrook. I sort of had a general sense that things weren't right, but I didn't. It was only as we educated ourselves through this process that I began to realize, hey, institutions are the opposite of what a developmentally disabled person needs. What they need is the love of their mom and dad, and their mom and dad need support to keep them at home so that it's not much more difficult to raise a developmentally disabled child than it is to raise a so-called normal child. And a developmentally disabled child can bring a lot of spiritual benefits to the family. So we all learned that together, and as we learned it, we got more militant, because Willowbrook was getting worse. They were cutting the budget and things, and the services, which were bad when I went there, got worse. Instead of having 2 or 3 attendants with 70 individuals, they would have 1 as a matter of routine.
You know, I should have asked this earlier, but what was the range of ages of the clients?
They would be admitted at a very young age, many of them. If they had severe physical disabilities especially, they would be admitted at the age of 1 or 2 or 3. And so they had pediatric wards, and then as they got older, they would be moved to different buildings with different age groups.
And, I mean, did it run into an adult and elderly population?
Yes, there were buildings where there were elderly. Not too many people lived to be very long there, to be very old there, but there were buildings where there were complete adults. And the building I was in served kids from the age of about 9 to 12 or 13, and sometimes we would admit a 9-year-old from the community new. And that was a wrenching experience, because their parent would be turning them over into this environment that I knew was going to feature trauma, you know, physical violence, rape, and it was just an untenable situation on a personal level. It was so hard.
What was the role of the administration, and what was the attitude of them towards the circumstances?
They were people who had been in the field of running institutions for a whole career. They were guys in their 50s and 60s, and they had been directors of institutions. They typically would live on the grounds of the institution. They were institutionalized themselves. They saw over the years that this situation had been the same, and that they felt strongly that it wasn't going to change anytime soon. And they, in fact, incorporated within themselves this definition of a mentally retarded person being more like an animal that needed to be contained in a building, taken out of their family. They completely bought into that whole ideology. And so they created this paradigm within the institution of, okay, this is what we do. We're the place where these people are taken out of society. It's more like a prison model. And you know, we're going to run it efficiently. We're going to have doctors here. We're going to have nurses. But they couldn't open their mind to the fact that maybe this wasn't the best environment. They couldn't go there in their mind.
Hmm. And as you would be concerned about the circumstances and trying to make some adjustments, was there any reception from the administration to new ideas?
I don't think they were paying attention. We would rebel. We would have a doctor's meeting once a month, and the other members of the medical staff, Dr. Bill Bronston and I, were pretty isolated, really. We were raising these issues of quality of care, the issues of trauma and lack of adequate supervision. And the medical staff was, reacting against our complaints about the system. So they were not helpful. There were some kind and decent people there, but as a group, they were there to protect the jobs and the institution as it was. The administration was overtly just wanting to maintain themselves as a bureaucracy. They didn't want to lose clients. They wanted to. Their view was, and I think this came from many, many years of their experience, we are bureaucrats and we are here to continue this facility as it is. And that I don't think that those of us who were trying to make change were considered to be very important. Numerically, we were not. And so their response to us was, that we were a minor irritant, but that was about the way they looked at us, as I recall it.
Were you aware of CSEA at that time, and did they have any presence at the facility?
CSEA was a union at Willowbrook, and at that time I honestly don't remember that they had a structured presence. I'm pretty sure in my building there was no union shop steward or anybody to enforce the idea that these employees shouldn't be forced to do more than they're trained to do. The employees could be made to speed up, and so that one worker would have to take care of 70 retarded people, an entirely impossible job. And I don't think that the CSEA was organized at that time in that institution to speak up against those conditions, at least not that I recall in my building.
And do you remember any attitude among the staff towards CSEA generally?
I don't. I don't remember about the attitude toward the CSEA, actually.
You mentioned earlier that to a large degree the parents were not aware of the conditions. What kind of interaction was there between the parents and the staff, and did that kind of begin to evolve over some time in your experience there?
The relationship would vary depending on the staff and the parent. Most of the parents would try to find a staff member. If this was a parent that visited regularly, they would, this would be a many-year relationship, and they would try to identify a friendly face among a staff member that could tell them a few words about how their relative or child was doing. And so that would be what they would seek. In general, sometimes they would succeed, and sometimes, though, an impersonal staff member would just present their child to them. But if they possibly could, they would want to bring a little extra something for their child and be able to give it to a human face that was kind and that would take it and promise to make sure that their child could utilize that for the rest of the week, whether it be a pair of socks or a small toy or something like that.
Okay. And was there awareness to any extent about the conditions among elected officials or in the outside community?
I don't think so. I know Robert Kennedy had toured Willowbrook in, I think, 67 or something like that, about 4 or 5 years before I was there, and stated that it was a snake pit at that time. The local officials on Staten Island defended the institution. There was a PR effort as people would be brought to Willowbrook, and a few model buildings that had been funded with extra funds from research grants and things. They would be toured through there, and then they would be taken out, and they didn't seem to answer or ask any more questions than that. No local official ever did while I worked there.
Mm-hmm. Tell me then how things began to change. How did your attitude begin to change? What were some of the actions that you took, and how did events evolve?
We started really small. Dr. Bill Bronston and I and social workers, a couple of real progressive social workers that we were working with, started going on Sundays and hosting weenie roasts outside of our building, because they had these pits where, cooking pits, outside. And we would have an educational session about mental retardation and what is appropriate in mental retardation on a small level. And at first, just a couple of the parents and their kids from my building came. But when they saw that we were consistent and we kept coming Sunday after Sunday, gradually more came. And at first it was an educational process. We would have speech therapists saying, these kids can learn to talk and enunciate words and communicate. And we would have physical therapists saying they really function much better if their legs if they have exercise program. Occupational therapists about buttoning and clothing themselves, and how much more efficient it is if you really train them so that they can dress themselves. And people who were, ultimately, we had a community meeting, and this was several months after we had gotten started, but our organization was growing exponentially because there was a hunger on the part of the parents to get together and meet each other. And it was a therapeutic thing, sort of like a cancer support group, I think, Mm-hmm. And so it was growing, and it was electric. And so we sponsored a community meeting where the World Health Organization's expert on mental retardation was good enough to come to Staten Island. And he publicly said, he was from Scandinavia, where they were very advanced in the way they would treat mentally retarded people. He said, this is not the way mentally retarded people should be treated. This is very primitive, very outdated. They need community services. Family is what a mentally retarded person needs. Family. They need a mom and a dad that loves them, that can teach them the way you'd teach anybody. Only those mom and dads need help themselves, because it is a more difficult job. The kids learn more slowly. That's the only thing about them. They learn more slowly. But you can't, the minute you take them out of the family circle, things go downhill. And that was a revolutionary thing for all of us. I mean, I didn't know that when I went to Willowbrook. And so that changed things. That was a focal point that where we began to be perceived within Willowbrook and certainly by the administration as a more significant enemy, I think, because we were talking bad about the institution. And so, you know, this institution was fostered largely on Staten Island in churches, and people would volunteer there, and they supported Willowbrook. So any group of us that was saying bad things about Willowbrook, we were just perceived as maybe being some kind of an enemy. We weren't really wanting to be an enemy, but we had to say maybe we should think that about the possibility that this large institution is doing harm, and that changed what the parents thought. We had to rethink a lot of our positions about, well, what do you do? Do you cut off admissions, therefore? But there were really still no community services. I mean, we didn't know. We didn't know what we should do, but we did know what we thought, and that's why we feel so bad about being here. The whole place can't serve the mentally retarded. They're gonna get worse here instead of better, because you can't learn without love and without personal attention.
The groups that you were bringing together, were they largely just kind of an informal group of parents, or were there other organizations involved? I mean, for example, I know that what was then known as the AHRC, the Association for the Help of Retarded Children, was relatively prominent in New York at that time. Were they involved in this effort?
There was an organization called the Benevolent Society at Willowbrook, which, as I recall, was affiliated with the AHRC, and there was a crossover. Some of the family members that were coming to our Weenie Roast and our meetings, and by the way, we started to have larger meetings, more political activist kind of things after 7 or 8 months. But there was an overlap. Some of the parents that were coming to these meetings were also involved in the Benevolent Society. But the Benevolent Society had traditionally been sort of bringing presents at Christmas time and things like well-meaning things like that, but not coming with an idea that they're going to change anything.
Okay. And as your efforts began to attract more people and have more interaction, what was the response on the part of the administration?
Well, it was very negative. The director of the institution, a fellow by the name of Dr. Jack Hammond, who I think was in his early 60s at that time, had been a long-time administrator, been an administrator at several different institutions, was invited to a meeting of the parents group. And this was after Governor Nelson Rockefeller had cut the budget at Willowbrook, and there was a job freeze. My job I couldn't become a permanent employee, even though I had been there for over a year, because they were freezing all permanent positions in the case that they would have to do more layoffs. And there would be only one attendant on a ward routinely, and we had been taking the parents back in the back rooms. I mean, that was part of our parents' organization. As the doctor in the building, I was the boss. I said, you can come back here. Look, this is what it is. And so these parents were pretty hot. They were pretty mad. And they insisted that Dr. Hammond take a public stand against the conditions at Willowbrook in this meeting. And he stood up and said, I'm not going to do any such thing. I've been in this business long enough to know that that's not going to do any good for these patients or for me or for you. We have to work within this system. And they said, get out of here. If you're not going to help us, you leave. So they made him leave. And that was on a Sunday. And on the following Monday, a memorandum was sent out to each and every employee, because several of us were at that meeting, saying that we couldn't go to any more of the parent meetings. And we did continue to go to the parent meetings. We disobeyed that memorandum, And those of us who were not permanent employees, who could be fired without cause, were fired. That was precipitated my getting fired and the social worker in my building getting fired.
Tell me more about the circumstances of that. How did that actually get executed?
Well, they gave me a pink slip. The building supervisor just said, "This is for you," and you're fired. And so that was it. I mean, I just had to clean out my office and leave. But crucially, they forgot one thing, and that is, I had a key. And that key opened the doors, the locked metal doors in every building of this big concentration camp. So that was a big mistake on their part. But the administrator simply handed me a pink slip, and that was it. It was pretty simple. I was pretty devastated.
And you were basically summarily dismissed at that point.
Right.
Literally right out the door
And
from that?
And the social worker, but her office wasn't really in my building, but there were two of us that were fired.
Do you think that it was because of your activism that you were targeted?
There was no doubt about that.
Okay, so what happened after that?
Well, I ended up, I think within about 24 hours, it just happened that I was a friend of this local newsman in New York named Geraldo Rivera. And we were good enough friends that he trusted me that the conditions were bad. And so he met me at a diner near Willowbrook on a morning, and using our key, he was a very different kind of an investigative reporter. He was willing to go into this institution. That hadn't been done, except I think there'd been a documentary called Titicut Follies of an institution for the mentally ill. But nobody had ever really gone into an institution and put on in public TV, on TV, a direct viewing of the actual conditions in these institutions. It was considered not ethical to do that at that time, but we did. Our view was, and we discussed it at the time, that this was sort of like filming a motor vehicle accident. This is a disaster here. This is a public situation. This isn't to be kept under wraps. And so he was trusting me that the conditions were bad, and as he later said, it was much worse than I had described. So what we did was we went in the back door, and because they had such a low level of employee, I mean, sometimes we would be filming in a day room, and there would be nobody there. They wouldn't even know we were there. Or there would be one employee who wouldn't bother to go out and tell their boss we were there. They supported what we were doing. It was an unbearable situation.
Did you go with Geraldo?
Yes, yes. I would open the door. We went together, not just once, but many, many days. And I give him great credit for grasping the importance of this and the true situation instantly. When he first smelled it and his crew first smelled it, they said, "What? What is going on here?" And so day after day we kept returning, and he vowed to return, and he did.
Did the administration catch any wind that you were there and doing this?
Yes, I think that same day, I think they had called the television station and threatened that that they shouldn't put that footage on the air. But the producer of the show did.
Did you, I mean, when you were going in, did you do this at the off shifts, or did you do it just during the
We just
normal
went during the day. We
day?
went in the morning during the day shift.
Were the other staff receptive to you being there?
Yes, this was really an interesting thing, that no staff member ever said, "Leave, you can't do this." The Willowbrook did start hiring security agents at the gates. So instead of being able to just drive in, we had to park, on the periphery and leap over the stone wall and run down to where the buildings were. But the employees themselves never did anything but smile at us and wave and say, here it is. You know, they really were not wanting to squash this information. I think an instinct in them said, yeah, you know, let the people see this stuff.
I mean, of course, you have this backdrop that the governor has cut the budget, that there are threats of layoffs that are also coming into the mix.
Yes. So and that was a threat to them, and I don't think they thought it could get much worse. I mean, so the administrators or the building supervisors, it was an understood thing that you wouldn't want them to know you were there, and the employees didn't. I mean, we filmed without any interruption, without and ever being evicted from any building, because we would be gone by the time they knew we were there.
And you did actually go multiple times.
Many times for months actually, but it did taper off, and then at that point, I mean, this started having huge ratings because the people of New York City were shocked, and they were watching it. And so at one point there were 4 different TV stations with their cameras, not just Geraldo. So I mean, I felt like a Pied Piper. All I was doing, I had the key, and that was kind of my role. I was the guy that would be opening the door.
So, I mean, you said that Geraldo grasped the enormity of what was happening here rather quickly. Was he very quick to get this on the air, or was there, you know, a little bit of a lag to research it and be prepared, or was it something that was just so visceral that he took it immediately to air?
He took it immediately to air. It was the first day that we filmed. It was on TV that night. He and his producer were editing it, and I was standing there, and they had a lot of footage, and they were editing it, and they brought this to the attention of the people of New York. And he did have to go to his producer and make the case to put it on the air, because the institution had called his producer and said, you better not put that on the air. This is private, these are private lives, and you cannot film that and put that on the air. These are our patients. And so that was the dilemma, and he is an attorney, and he could cite legalities about it, and as a producer was an attorney, and Geraldo won, because also it was clear that this would get everybody's attention, and that it was a newsworthy item. It was truly news. It wasn't a private thing that you could say was protected under people's privacy rights. There was nothing, they had no privacy there.
Tell me on a personal level, I mean, what was your motivation in going to Geraldo, and what did you think would come of this?
Well, we had been trying to get people's attention. One of the things that our parents group knew was that if it was only us, we probably wouldn't win. The public had to support us, but they had no way to know what we were saying. We had leafleted outside of the institution. When people would come in, we would leaflet and say, please join us. And we had a reporter from the local Staten Island newspaper, the Staten Island Advance. Her name was Jane Curtin, and she was very good. And she came and did a multi-part series on Willowbrook, in which she pointed out that there were many deficiencies in that institution, and as she went through it with us. But that didn't get anybody's attention because she wasn't filming it. I mean, people basically cannot believe it if you're just saying something is atrocious. It's different from people seeing it. And so I think it was only when they saw it on the film footage, you know, in their evening news, and they couldn't believe that this was their city, and that this kind of thing with young children in straitjackets rocking with and being covered with feces was happening in their city.
And what beyond that was the official response from the state and the administration, and how did that then evolve?
state, within a few weeks, this Governor Rockefeller freed up $9 million in emergency funds, and that was to buy shoes and buy extra clothes because the inmates were down to one change of clothes a day. If they soiled these clothes, they were naked the rest of the day when this expose hit. But then after that, they would have more than one change of clothes. So it was cosmetic, and they really thought it would blow over. I'm sure that was what was in their mind, that if they just sort of made it so that bad pictures couldn't be made, that everything would be fine. So that was their response. It was just, this is another blip in the chart, but these institutions aren't going to change, and we have our own plan for these people, and we're taking a cold shower here from this bad publicity, but it's going to go away.
But it didn't. It continued.
It did continue. The Geraldo made with the help of Dr. Bill Bronston, who had experience in California, where the state, even under Ronald Reagan, another Republican governor, had provided community services and begun to not admit patients to institutions. And so in this documentary called Willowbrook, How It Is and Why It Doesn't Have to Be That Way, which had the highest Nielsen rating of any TV documentary in New York City up until that time, it made the point that it doesn't really have to be that way, and there can be legislative changes that can begin to make these changes, and that it's being done elsewhere in the country and elsewhere in the world.
After all of this happened, what did you personally do? Did you continue to be involved with this, and what did you do professionally?
I was pretty involved in this because it was getting the attention of a lot of people and a lot of organizations of the developmentally disabled on Staten Island and elsewhere in the state of New York. I would go and talk to them about my experiences there. And to earn money, I was working just as a physician in the emergency room at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx. And then I went back to Kansas City, actually. About 6 months after this happened, I went back to Kansas City and finished my residency. I didn't stay. I was sort of, I was frankly, I think, having post-traumatic stress syndrome. I didn't like being fired, and I am not a warrior. I'm more of a healer and a nurturing person, and I don't respond well to fighting with people all the time. So I was not ready to just fight the battle. Didn't feel like I could do it.
Why did you feel you had to do it?
In the first place?
Yeah.
Because I was responding to the situation. I mean, you just get desperate. I mean, I think it was a desperate move to put it on TV, and it was an act of desperation, and it was completely what our parent organization needed as well. In retrospect, was to get people's attention and to get the people of New York on our side instead of being ignorant about what was going on there.
From your experience through this trauma, can you what have you gained in terms of insight and advice? What kind of advice might you offer to others who struggle with circumstances that they find intolerable?
Every situation is different, and just as far as if you are in a situation where you think the circumstances are intolerable, there are all levels of that, and you have to analyze who are your friends and who are your enemies, and help to coordinate your friends and organize them and create unity among them with a clear vision of what the situation is and what a possible corrective factor would be. And that does require first education and coming together, and also having the originality to maybe figure out that the situation is intolerable, because what was striking at Willowbrook was that It was tolerable, even though it wasn't an intolerable situation, because they could define these inmates as being more like animals than humans. It was okay. And so to always step back and say, how am I defining this individual? I mean, right now we've got 2 million Americans in prisons, for example. We got over 1 million Americans in nursing homes. Step back from that situation and say, how are we defining this? What's resulted in this? Because that's a very high rate of institutionalization in those two settings. So try to educate yourself about the situation, and try to see these clients as people with potential. And so those are some of the lessons that I've had.
Obviously, as a result of much of your effort and of course many others, we do have a better system of care today for individuals with developmental disabilities. Are you proud of your experience and what you did?
I am. It varies a lot. My nephew has a son with Down syndrome named Michael, and named after me, and he's my buddy, and he's 4 now, and he lives in Kansas, and he is now in preschool, and he's had the benefit of physical therapy, and this is all publicly supported physical therapy. I mean, my sister, his grandma, took him on when his mom and dad had to work, and she's really done such a good job with him. The point is that in Kansas, they've got a pretty decent system of preschool services, and that's really important. So wherever you are to study what system you have, it varies tremendously from state to state. In New York now, there are a lot more community services. I personally think it should be better for kids in the preschool ages, and I'm no big expert because I don't live in New York, so I'm not saying that it's perfect, but at least we don't have large institutions, and I believe in the concept of normalization. Again, I go back to the point that staying in the home with the family, crucial, and having an environment in which your family can stay related to you even when you turn 20 or 21 and you normally would move out of your home. That's a normal situation. Move to a normal environment, not an industrial environment, but a normal home-like environment with people who know you and love you, and not with big crowds, but in a small living situation. And then you will continue to have a human life. And if you have good training and education when you're young and people that love you, you will develop. I mean, there's so many stories, even from my building. One, Jimmy Jimenez, was a kid who lived on the unit where the blind kids were and the autistic kids, and he was a guy that was a sculptor. He wanted to have aluminum foil. If you would bring him a roll of aluminum foil, by the end of the day, he would make a sculpture for you that was amazing. But he was nonverbal. He would just say, silver paper, silver paper. He would just sit there and make his sculptures. Okay, he got out of Willowbrook as a result of the consent decree. And he now has a job, and he lives independently. He's not having to be supported by any agency whatsoever. The point is that if you put somebody in an institution where there's nobody around but other developmentally disabled people in a room with walls and a TV and nothing else, you're not going to learn anything. So it's that human. I don't even remember the question that you asked. And
But I mean, the point is that the awareness and the change, even on a national basis, is largely traced to what you did at Willowbrook.
I hope so, and I think it was probably going to happen. It had happened in Scandinavia. This was so, in retrospect, so self-evident. We were just saying, hello, this is the situation, and it is wrong, and let's start changing this now. But I'm very happy that what we did, it just happened that as a result of our organizing and my getting fired and knowing Geraldo, it was a good mix of circumstances that resulted in a lot of changes.
Well, we have a lot more to talk about with the dynamics, but I think that's a good break point, and thank you.
You're welcome.